Greetings, church history friends, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Barb Walden, and tonight I will serve as your host for our 8th lecture in the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation's Church History Without Boundaries Autumn Lecture Series. We greatly appreciate you joining us this evening as we continue to explore Community of Christ history around the world. In tonight's program, we will hear about Bishop R.C. Evans of Canada from my dear friend and one of our favorite guest speakers, John Hamer. Now, I can't forget to introduce you to my wonderful co-host who we see every week, and that's Megan Reed. Megan is working on her master's degree at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. She's also serving as a student intern in the Alma Blair Internship Program, a young adult program at the historic sites made possible thanks to your generous donations. I regret that our other co-host, Peter Smith, isn't able to join us tonight. Now, Peter is healthy and well. He's just on the road this week and will not be able to be with us. However, he will be back with us on Saturday for Andrew Bolton's lecture. So for all of our Peter Smith fans, I assure you we will see him again on Saturday. Our Church History Without Boundaries Autumn Lecture Series is not only a great way to spend the evening learning church history, it's also a benefit for the Community of Christ historic sites. You see, the sites are temporarily closed for public safety due to COVID-19. However, the preservation and maintenance needs of the sites continues on. Your donations are especially critical this year, as the loss of revenue from site preservation fees and museum store sales in 2020 is unprecedented. As we continue to work towards the goal of becoming self-sustaining, your donations from tonight's lecture will go a long way towards supporting and preserving Community of Christ historic sites for future generations. In fact, tonight is a great night to donate as we are beginning our fall fundraising campaign, and our board of directors has generously offered to match the first $7,000 in donations that we receive. That means donations given tonight will be doubled thanks to the generosity of our board members. Megan will also drop the online donations link and mailing address in the chat box just now. Thank you for helping preserve church heritage with your generous donations, and double the donations tonight. Now, the last person I want to introduce you to tonight is our guest speaker. John Hamer's roots go back 7 generations to the early 1830s. Although raised a Mormon as an adult, he considered himself unchurched until he encountered Community of Christ at the Kirtland Temple in 2000. John is a map maker and historian whose work has illustrated dozens of books, articles, and films on the history of the Latter-day Saint movement. John has published a variety of articles and co-authored several books related to Community of Christ history. He is a former president of the John Whitmer Historical Association, and today John serves as pastor and outreach coordinator for the Community of Christ congregation, Toronto Center Place, located in Toronto, Canada. In fact, for many of you, he might be a familiar face, the one you see every Sunday in their online worship services. If you haven't attended one of those services, I'd encourage you to do so. They really are powerful services. So welcome, John, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'll turn the microphone over to you as we are all ready to hear about R.C. Evans.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me? Was my mic going? Very, very good. Well, I'm so excited to be here and to be part of this lecture series. I'm a huge fan of, well, Barb, and also the historic sites and the Historic Sites Foundation generally, and the work that you're all doing is just so amazing. And I'm especially gratified as a church historian that the fall lecture series has been about international church history, because this is a kind of thing that we don't always cover. We tend to get stuck in focusing on, let's say, the first 15 years or so of early church history, and that gets focused on headquarters and really Joseph Smith too much. And so being able to draw out our studies and our focus more broadly, and to understand the full journey of a people, not just in the early times, but all the way up to the present even. And so really to look at this really interesting time that we're going to talk about tonight in the history of the reorganization, this time period at the end of Joseph III's presidency and the beginning of Fred M. Smith's. And so I'm going to share my screen here and see if we can get right into it. All right. Is that looking good? I hope. And so my lecture tonight is entitled Bishop R.C. Evans of Canada, from the RLDS First Presidency to Schismatic Church Leader. And so R.C. Evans, you can see him pictured here on a stage. You saw it maybe in the, let me see if I make sure this is going. Yes, you saw in the advertisement for this, him, you could see kind of very tiny up in the front. He's the one standing in front of this entire audience. So this is one of Toronto's historic theaters. He spoke in a number of different ones very routinely, and lecture series that what they would do on Sunday night. They would rent out the theater and he would preach, and they'd fill the theaters up like this. And it was an amazing kind of outreach. So you can see kind of, oops, I'll go back there. So you see the other facing it from the other way here on the stage now. It's hard to say. It may well be that certainly he was the most gifted orator, I think, of his, in the reorganization of his time period, but considering we don't have his words to compare or how he spoke them. I mean, we have just the written version in books form. He may well have been, he's certainly in the running for, the most gifted orator in the entire restoration of any time. This was certainly one of his most amazing gifts. So he was also a prominent RLDS leader and a close personal friend of Prophet President Joseph III. And so this is a picture here. Almost all of these pictures we have in the archives of the Toronto congregation here in downtown Toronto. And you can see this is a General Conference Planning Committee right at the end of the 19th century. And I'm just circling here, you can see President Joseph III, who's an older man at this point, and Apostle at the time, R.C. Evans, who's a much younger man at this time. R.C. Evans also accompanied President Joseph Smith III in 1903 tour of Great Britain. And so you can see the two of them there again, Joseph III and R.C. Evans. And he entertained at that time especially ambitions to be Joseph III's successor. Joseph III had made it clear that succession to the presidency in the church resulted in his era from the appointment of the previous prophet, so his dad having appointed him to be prophet, not because he was his son, but because of the appointment. And so therefore it didn't have to stay within the Smith family, as it now hasn't stayed within the Smith family. And so Evans openly entertained the idea that Joseph III would name him the successor rather than his own son, F.M. Smith, who was younger and much less experienced in church leadership than Evans. However, we'll also see tonight, with all of his talents and ambitions, Joseph III and many contemporaries recognized in Evans a worrying tendency towards egotism and vainglory. And so we will see kind of there's a little bit of that too tonight. So I started off in the front with, this is the title picture, and you can see him again, R.C. Evans in the middle here of the church in Toronto. This was the Toronto Congregation's church at the beginning of the 20th century, the Soho Street Church. And then behind them, obscured, we'll see a bit later, is actually the historic mini folds window. And so if we took them away, this is just looking at the church with the church empty, you can see right in the middle behind the podium, you can see that mini folds stained glass window there. And that is the windows that are still maintained by the congregation that we have here in Toronto centerplace. So those stained glass windows from the Soho Street Church. So anyway, going back to that picture, in addition to R.C. Evans in the middle of this grouping, you can also see off to the left, there's a portrait of Joseph III on the wall. Right in front of him, there's this amazing bust of Joseph III. And then over to the right, there's also right on the wall, right at the front of the church, a picture of R.C. Evans. And that's not the only image of R.C. Evans in the church, because on the wall, on the stained glass windows on the opposite side of the church, and I don't have, unfortunately, a great picture of this. You can kind of just barely make it out on the left, and I've redrawn it on the right to explain it. There's other stained glass windows that really, I think, presaging a problem. And so there is a triptych stained glass window here of Joseph Smith, Jesus Christ, and those two people are flanking and buttressing R.C. Evans, who is at the center of the illustration here. So it takes a little bit of ego, I think, to have your church decorated in that way. So in that sense, then, what I want to tell tonight is a little bit of a remarkable story, but also a little bit of a cautionary story. So Toronto congregation historian June McLean Pugsley, reflecting on Evans' 1918 schism from the church. So 50 years earlier, in 1967, she noted, quote, "This incident brought great sorrow to the hearts of the Toronto saints. It cannot be omitted from any account of the growth of Toronto branch, yet one hesitates to try and interpret the meaning of the division of thought. Better to remember with gratitude that which went before and leave to God the judgment that this trying hour requires." So it's a sad, and it was hard to remember, chapter in the congregation's history, even a half century after it occurred, in part because it not only divided the branch, but it divided families very much so. So to begin to tell the story, I want to note some of the historiography, some of the sources that we have. And we have just an amazing and rich collection of primary sources. I've only been able to just, in this particular lecture that we're having, just barely scratch the surface of what we know and can say. So the sources for the study of R.C. Evans' life are plentiful. During his time as an RLDS leader in Canada, Herald House published his autobiography, and the Canadian Church published a collection of sermons in 1912, and then later a collection of his songs, poems, notes, and correspondence. In addition, there's all kinds of contemporary articles and church periodicals, both at headquarters, the Herald, and also from the church in Canada. Got an illustration here of a broadside that they published, or a brief pamphlet called Bishopric of Canada that explained the change in church leadership status in Canada in 1909. So there's also all kinds of letters between R.C. Evans and church leaders that have been preserved. Locally, also, the congregation just maintains archives that includes everything from like sacramental registries and tithing registries that date back to R.C. Evans' time in the church. So him signing marriage certificates, etc. And the sources are frankly equally as plentiful, and even more so after Evans' break with the church, including his own account of why he left, along with the RLDS responses from headquarters, from the congregation, and also from important Canadian leaders, including J.J. Cornish, who wrote an open letter to R.C. Evans after he'd left. And the sources also include, I have a whole transcript of Evans' January 26, 1919 lecture, where he filled out that theater again in order to attack his former faith now. Complete then also with, we have a book this thick of all the transcripts and testimony from the 1919 and 1920 lawsuits and countersuits between the RLDS Church and R.C. Evans. The records of Evans' church that he founded afterwards have been preserved in the Ontario archives, including all the minutes of the business meetings from Evans' tenure as leader of that church. And then beyond all of those rich primary sources, which are even more plentiful than what I just listed, there are also secondary studies. So Roger Lanius published an important treatment of Evans' career in the RLDS Church in the third volume of the JWHA Journal, 1983, it should say, I think. R.C. Evans, Boy Orator of the Reorganization. And Ronald Smith authored 2 papers of R.C. Evans' later years. One is called Milltown, the Last Years of R.C. Evans, and he also has a history of the Church of the Christian Brotherhood of R.C. Evans' church that he founded, and then its subsequent history until its dissolution. Just to give a little bit of context, I want to just look at, R.C. Evans didn't emerge out of nowhere, but there was a background history of the congregation in Toronto that goes almost all the way back to the beginning of the organization of the church across the lake in upstate New York, and has consequences to the present. And so I just created this timeline to kind of show R.C. Evans' period here is highlighted in pink, as R.C. Evans helped organize the 3rd organization, the 3rd branch in Toronto, and grew it to one of its more maximal sizes when he left. So as I mentioned, Toronto is actually just across the lake from the cradles of the Restoration, Palmyra, and then later Kirtland. Early members went on missions here to Upper Canada at the time. It was called to Ontario very early on. So for example, Heber Kimball, one of the original apostles, predicted that his fellow apostle Parley Pratt would go to Upper Canada, even the city of Toronto, the capital, where he would find a people prepared for the gospel. And so as a result of that mission, Pratt and 5 companions went from Kirtland to Toronto, where they met John and Leonora Taylor, who were part of a small group of religious seekers who were dissenting from the Methodist faith. And after hearing Pratt's preaching, and after some further discussions, they were baptized and became the nucleus of a new congregation in Toronto. So Taylor was ordained to be an elder, and when Pratt and the other missionaries continued their journey, he was left behind as pastor of the newly organized Toronto branch of the church. So from that start in 1836, this is the oldest part of the city of Toronto, so Old Town. And I just have on here on this this little map of that where John and Leonora Taylor's home would have been in 1836, where the branch would have met in cottage meetings. And then the location of Toronto Centre Place today is just a block or 2 away from where that original beginning was. One of the things that was true for all of the branches everywhere in the organization is that the Taylors and everyone else, all leaders, felt compelled to gather to Zion, to Missouri, or to wherever church headquarters was. And so the Taylors left, and that really sapped the strength of the congregation, as was true in so many places. And so at some point or other, even though there's a continuity of members from the early time period, there's not a continuity of leaders and organization where they met every week. And so because of this and so many other places, according to Lori, if you drive around in Canada, you go to this on the way from Toronto to Michigan, there's a road, an exit called Nauvoo Road, which according to Lore is so named because of the large number of church members who were emigrating out of Ontario and going to Nauvoo. And obviously the ones leaving are the ones that are really disproportionately committed and vigorous. And so as a result, branches struggled to fill the gaps. And at some time in the 1840s, Toronto, they stopped meeting. And then obviously the church disorganized, reorganized in April 60, and the General Conference of the reorganization sent missionaries out again to gather all of the scattered saints. And so Canadian member John Shippey took the news back to Ontario and organized the Blenheim branch in what became the Chatham district in 1862. And through Shippey's efforts, many Canadian members of the early church affiliated with the reorganization, including Arthur Leverton, who was a very effective missionary whose first convert was none other than the legendary J.J. Cornish, who is totally worth a lecture if you haven't done one of him yet, too, for the CCHSF lecture series. Cornish, in turn, became one of the church's quintessential missionaries, probably the most one, planting just dozens of congregations across Ontario and Michigan, and later, in late in life, often the prairie provinces as well. Among the thousands of people converted by J.J. Cornish was Joseph Luff of Toronto. He was baptized in 1876 and ordained an elder very soon afterwards. Luff gathered enough of the old members together to reorganize a Toronto branch, so the second branch, which began meeting for the first time since the 1840s. And they even purchased a small building on Arthur Street, which is now Dundas Street. But once again, the branch disorganized because Luff was called into the 12. He immigrated to Missouri. His house, the Luff House, is actually one of the sites preserved by the Historic Sites Foundation and by the church at Heritage Plaza in Independence, just across from the stone church. Anyway, so without leadership, Toronto branch once again lost its building and ceased meeting for a while. But in the meantime, J.J. Cornish was also responsible for the conversion of R.C. Evans. Evans was born in St. Andrews, Quebec in 1861, and he wasn't raised in the church, but his father joined the RLDS church during a missionary revival in Toronto when R.C. Evans was 14. Then 2 years later, R.C. Evans and his mother joined the church when they went to a revival where J.J. Cornish was preaching. Evans later described Cornish's preaching as keeping his hearers spellbound. And this is how Evans describes it. Quote, his voice was not a pleasant one. And it does turn out that anytime R.C. Evans, I feel like, is giving a compliment to somebody else, especially a speaker, he compares them unfavorably with himself, right? Because he's the best orator of all times. Anyway, so even the greatest missionary of all times in the church, J.J. Cornish, he's like, his voice was not a pleasant one, but it thrilled my very soul, he says. I was convinced that every word he spoke came from an honest heart. Great tears were streaming from his eyes, and soon I too was searching after my handkerchief to wipe the tears that were running down my cheeks. And so Evans, 16-year-old at the time, asked Cornish to baptize him, which they did. They broke the ice in a frozen river here in Canada on November 5th, 1876, where he was baptized. So R.C. Evans, very smart and a reader and a quick student. He had the zeal now of a very gifted convert. And so he rapidly gained a testimony of the restoration and the reorganization. And by the way, at that time, these two were only 46 and 16 years old, respectively. So the reorganization is just getting going. The whole restoration is really only a couple generations at most old. And so one of the apostles for the area, Apostle John Lake, saw a lot of promise in Evans. And so at the age of 20, he ordains Evans a priest in 1882. Just 2 years later, an elder, 2 years later, now a 70. So he's a 70 by age 24. And under that time, he also comes under general church appointment, which is to say he becomes a church employee. And so at that time also, when he's an elder, he serves as the presiding elder of the London congregation in the 1880s. The successor congregation, it was anyway one of the most important congregations in the RLDS church in Canada at the time. And still is very important congregation. So recognized as a gifted orator, all right from the start, Evans proved to be an extremely effective missionary, and people just couldn't believe his preaching. And so as a result, congregations everywhere would request to have him come for preaching meetings. And so he frequently would schedule his travel like a whole year in advance so that, you know which Sunday he was going to show up in what town. He was also a really canny self-promoter. And so we sometimes think of all the things that we do nowadays in terms of social media and other kinds of ways that we invite people into our kinds of services. And we think that that's all pretty new. But in fact, there was a lot of cutting edge advertising type stuff that people did all the way back. And this is certainly true for R.C. Evans. And so when his time for speaking in a particular town would approach, the local congregation would be supplied with the pre-made materials for an advertising campaign. And that included them taking out paid ads in local newspapers, sending out press releases and things like that to try to solicit free newspaper articles. They'd print handbills to pass out, and they would have these huge sandwich boards, and they'd walk all around and try to get people to fill these rented halls for R.C. Evans lectures and preaching tour. And so what happened is then in 1891, R.C. Evans in Toronto baptized 17-year-old, this is covered up on my screen, Frederick Gregory, who he remembered as an eager lad with a stutter. So again, he gives a compliment, but also a disparagement in terms of the person's speaking ability. So Gregory moved to Toronto, where he located a number of church members, most of whom were young women from other branches who had moved to the city for the work. And so they began to have cottage meetings. And at one of these, on September 17th, 1891, with 11 members attending, Evans presiding, the branch was reorganized and has met ever since. So that's what we date our current organization of Toronto Center Place, Toronto branch from, 1891. Gregory, who was now 20 and a priest, was made pastor of the branch, and it was a mostly female group as a result of women coming into the city for work. And so it was affectionately known as the Old Maids branch. One of the ladies was a woman named Minnie Faulds, and this is a picture of her much later in life. She had been crippled and forced to wear a leg brace, and had a vision and underwent a faith healing, and that was long remembered in the congregation. It's remembered in those stained glass windows that I mentioned, the Minnie Faulds windows. So afterwards, Faulds regularly volunteered in the congregation, and she often actually served as the president of the women's departments and other related departments. So about this time, like I say, Evans' sermons were very well regarded, and so they also became a highlight of the International Church's annual General Conference. And later, anyway, R.C. Evans believed, anyway, that he is the only RLDS leader who had ever been honored with preaching 3 sermons during a single conference. And Joseph III was certainly impressed with Evans' preaching ability and decided to call him into the 12 in 1897. So Evans, who is now 36, was also made president of the Church's Canada Mission. In that same year, 1897, the church held its first district conference in Toronto, renting the upper assembly room of City Hall on Front Street at the time. Joseph III was now 64 years old, having led the church for some 36 years. He was a widower for the second time, and while at this conference, he met Canadian member Ada Clark. Their marriage was solemnized the following year by R.C. Evans, and then later they went on to have children, including W. Wallace Smith, who was later one of the presidents of the church. Meanwhile, for the congregation, in 1900, the church purchased a small lot on Camden Street and volunteered together to build for themselves a small brick church. They didn't have a lot of experience building churches, and so afterwards it became affectionately known as the Church with the Crooked Walls, and it actually was outgrown almost immediately after they built it. By the time 1902 rolled around, Joseph III was now 69 years old, and he had really begun to think about, succession, what's going to happen after him. In a really significant turnover of RLDS leadership, one of the biggest, Joseph III presented a document to conference in 1902, later becomes DNC 126, that added 5 new apostles and also called R.C. Evans and his son F.M. Smith into the First Presidency. And so now Evans, now 40, he really considered himself to be senior to F.M. Smith, who was just 28 years old, had way less church leadership experience, and was actually, in the process of going to graduate school to get his PhD. And so in the next year, when Joseph III went on a tour of Great Britain to visit the church members in the UK, R.C. Evans accompanied him on this tour, and their relationship grew really very ever closer, and it almost became again akin to an adoptive father-son relationship. As the aging prophet really had very little stamina and routinely opened meetings with just some brief remarks before having to sit back down, and then he would turn things over to Evans, who would then keep everybody spellbound with his preaching. And so this successful tour really furthered R.C. Evans' sense that he was being groomed for the prophetic mantle. Going back into Toronto, beginning in 1905, he began to capitalize on his oratory skill by having the congregation rent out and fill theaters for a series of Sunday evening lectures. He held the audience spellbound as he filled just larger and larger venues, the Old Majestic, I believe Massey Hall, the Princess Theater, the Royal Alexandria. So all of these vast theaters, they're closed on Sundays by law, but they could rent to churches like this, and so they were able to get a good deal and then fill them up. And so converts to the church very, very quickly followed. You can see here in the slide one of the broadsides, one of the advertisements that they would put out and also wear as sandwich boards. So you can here's the folks in the congregation who have the giant bills that they're going around and advertising to get people into this. Congregation made very extensive use of advertising. Okay, and so I've showed you this before, but it's such an amazing picture. We have a copy of this big in the archives of the church in Toronto, and it's really an amazing picture. Okay, so during the 9 years that the theater meetings were held, membership in the congregation exploded from 250 in 1905 to 1,200 by 1918. So the congregation sold a little church with the crooked walls on Camden Street, and perhaps remembering their own lack of construction skills, they elected to just purchase rather than build a new church facility. So they bought a church that someone else had built on Soho Street in 1906, where they stayed for the next 20 years. And so here is the Toronto congregation members shortly after they had their new church home, the house on Soho Street. And if you look at above the door here, and that there's a 3-window stained glass window above the little point there, that's the stained glass windows with R.C. Evans, Joseph Smith, and Christ. And so here it is from the other side. Nevertheless, the new church was also a monument, I think, to Evans' growing ego. So as we say, we have this kind of idea that R.C. Evans is rarely understanding himself to be quite important with these decorations of the church. So there had already been some early warning signs that Joseph III was very aware of, and other leaders too. So already in 1896, Joseph had begun to fear that Evans might, his vanity might get so out of control that it would just start to impair his ministry. And so the church president wrote his wife, R.C. Evans' wife, Lizzie, and he tried to get her to help R.C. maintain perspective, pop his big head a little bit, and to bring him back down to earth so that he remembers, I don't know, to keep things in proportion. She shared the letter with R.C., who became really indignant, and he wrote back, really, there's no reason to be concerned. And but even so, Joseph wrote back again and said, yeah, there is pretty reason for concern, and cautioned R.C. again against pride, vanity, and specifically susceptibility to flatterers. And so cautioning R.C. Evans by letter, he wrote, do not permit the praise of your followers to make you vain is the injunction. In better expression, and I know that so long as you keep in mind the sources of where all strength in truth comes, you will not. But keep that in proportion. Remember that gifts come from God, and don't let just the praise of your followers, yes men, make you lose your judgment and perspective. Nevertheless, as the many poems, tributes, testimonies given in Evans' honor, which he collected and saved, obviously as accolades, and then later published as in this collection of songs, poems, notes, and correspondences, addresses presented to Bishop R.C. Evans from the many parts of the world, he definitely continued to receive and actually also, unfortunately, appreciate flattery. And so, for example, in that book, Maggie McGregor has a poem called The SS Convention, and there's a bunch of verses in it, but one of them is, we will call on R.C. Evans, a man of wondrous power, our chosen superintendent to lead us for the hour. And F.R. Tubb composed a life story of R.C. Evans for this 5 pages life story in poem, blank verse, and it was entitled From Newsboy to the Church Presidency. And so amongst that, he compares R.C. Evans very favorably to David when he conquers Goliath, and just calls Evans' eloquence, and its international fame are just extolled at length. And so, it's not a humble book. All right, so what ends up happening, despite what R.C. Evans hopes, the aging prophet, Joseph III, ends up naming his own son, F.M. Smith, to be his successor in a 1906 revelation that becomes Doctrine and Covenants 127. So Evans was clearly resentful of the decision, but he went back to Canada, where he continued to kind of run the show there in the church mission, and where he continued to build up his own following in Toronto. This was in the decades before supreme directional control, which is to say this controversy where F.M. Smith in later years is essentially contending with the presiding bishopric and the Council of Apostles to which of the leading councils of the church have a say in the case of conflict. And so this is kind of before that. And so there's not really clear lines of authority between those leading councils. Geographical areas of the church at this time are divided into kind of apostolic fields where the individual apostles can kind of maintain their own programs and ignore general church programming often. But one of the things that was happening is that Evans kind of had a direct administration as a member of the First Presidency of Canada, and that's kind of resented in part because the 12 complained that Evans wasn't really good at keeping records, or maybe sometimes didn't have any records. And so as a result, they did an inquiry and they did a canvass amongst themselves. They vote 5-2 to recommend that Joseph III, that he drop Evans from the first presidency. So finally in 1909, Joseph III was convinced to do that. So he talked to R.C. Evans and kind of worked it out with him, and R.C. Evans resigned. And then they, and that same time as kind of a solve, he decided to ordain Evans a bishop, and he created a new position called Bishop of Canada, which effectively allowed Evans to maintain control of the Canadian mission as kind of a semi-autonomous component of the church. And so it really wasn't a thing that the apostles, again, are not particularly happy with that decision, which again was just taken by the presidency. And in general, Evans then continues to hold aloof from church headquarters. And one local member who was complaining compared him to, let's say, a medieval vassal who was rebelling against his liege lord. So he's got his own little fief here in Canada, and there's nothing that the king can do about it, apparently. So although the church relationship was strained, the personal relationship between Joseph III and Evans continued to be very strong. And so when Joseph III took to his deathbed, he actually asked to see Evans, who traveled all the way from Canada to independence just before the prophet passed away, and was able to have some final words with him. After Joseph III's death, F.M. Smith now became prophet president of the church. And while Evans retreated back to Toronto, maintaining kind of an ever tighter control over the Canadian church, while ignoring and then also actually kind of criticizing publicly decisions that are happening at headquarters. So the relationship therefore begins to break down. So Evans continued to resent F.M. Smith, complaining, "I had 1,000 times more experience in church work than the new prophet, having, quote, labored for years as a priest, elder, 70 apostle." And their animosity that he was expressing ultimately kept Evans from being invited to speak at the 1918 General Conference. This is the first time he had been essentially snubbed in decades. And he charged really, guy had preached 10 times more than any man living at past general conferences. He's the speaker, he's the guy. And now he's being snubbed, in his opinion, by Smith. Although Smith would probably realizes that he's going to say something quite negative and doesn't really want that, to be happening. But in any event, it pretty much leads to a breakdown of relations. And so soon after, F.M. Smith decided that he just needs to get this thing under control. And with a committee of 3 church leaders, one of the apostles, one of the bishops, and himself, he goes to Toronto in order to review really Evans' administration. And once they're in Toronto, they have kind of weeks of confrontations. And at a certain point, that just builds until F.M. Smith allows Evans to have a full time to preach from the pulpit his idea of what was wrong. And apparently, Evans did so with such bitterness and antagonism going on and on for over an hour that the committee felt that they really didn't have any alternative than to silence Evans' priesthood, which F.M. Smith did soon thereafter. It's on June 2nd, 1918. So the following day, R.C. Evans publicly resigned his membership in the RLDS church and walked out of a business meeting. Of the 1,200 members of the congregation of the Toronto congregation on the rolls, some 300 to 400 followed R.C. Evans out of the church and into schism, and that people, they sometimes say that's a fourth or a third or something like that of the members. But you have to know that, I mean, oftentimes, again, it's going to be some of the more vigorous ones who are actually doing the walking out, because you may have more people on your rolls than you have actually showing up. And so it could have even been as much as half of the tithe paying members. And so Evans quickly moves to found his own church organization. And it's also using his connections, he's able to get it incorporated by an act of the provincial legislature. He originally wants it to be called the Church of Jesus Christ, but the legislature is kind of like, I think we got already had a bunch of those. And so they ultimately agree to the name Church of the Christian Brotherhood, which becomes the name of Evans' new church. And so unfortunately, this schism was very acrimonious. So in addition to taking members and apparently also some funds, it wasn't entirely clear, but it's ultimately ruled that way, Evans determined to use his new church as a platform to attack the RLDS church that he'd previously worked so hard to build up. And so the new church, the Church of the Christian Brotherhood, purchased an old church building, the former Erskine Presbyterian Church on Elm Street in Toronto, kind of in the hospital district now. You can see it here. It's very impressive. It's much more impressive than the facility that he walked out of on Soho Street. Evans and the members brought much of their previous organizational structure with them. So for example, the church's new charter specified that it was to be led by a presiding bishop. Guess who? And that also included a counselor, along with a presiding priest, a presiding teacher, presiding deacon, and assistants of those various offices. Evans also used his star power to fill theaters. So he filled Shea's Theater in Toronto on January 26, 1919. People were very happy to come in, because whenever the church people's two churches or something like this are fighting, the press gets involved and everyone wants to hear about scandal. And so he fills up the theater, and he has a big long diatribe speech that we have a transcript of in our archives here in Toronto, where he denounced the LDS Church in general and Joseph Jr. in particular. At one point, in the debate, in the question and answers, he challenges F.M. Smith to come to a future debate in Toronto at one of the theaters, and he charges, according to the transcript, to great applause, that his grandfather, F.M. Smith's grandfather, Joseph Smith Jr., taught, sanctioned, and practiced polygamy. So in other words, that in addition to all the other kinds of things that, the laundry list against the RLDS Church goes right for that one as well in the lecture. So he admitted, and one of the weaknesses was that obviously he changed his position. He had been an amazing advocate of Latter-day Saintism before, and so cleverly, or just realizing that he has that weak position to begin with, his lecture is essentially begun with the maxim: "Wise men change, fools never." So in other words, he has learned that he was wrong before, and as a person who's wise, he is prepared now to have embraced truth, having rejected past error in his view. The RLDS Church responded in kind, so gave just as good as it got. So Evans had proclaimed that his decision to found a new church had been sanctioned by an angel, but that claim was too vague and too convenient by half for RLDS members. He didn't really say when the angel came or what, but anyway, in most of the pamphlets and things like that, the responses, RLDS members mocked that testimony as not very credible. That famed Canadian leader, J.J. Cornish, was still around, and he penned an open letter to Evans urging repentance. The Toronto congregation actually began to publish a newsletter for the first time. So volume 1, number 1 of the newsletter is talking about R.C. Evans, and then so are the next 10 issues, after he's left, kind of thing. And then it explains, therefore, like the perspective of the members who stayed in the church. In addition, F.M. Smith authorized the church to sue Evans for financial improprieties that he charged had occurred in his tenure as being bishop. So not being careful with the books, not being careful with the numbers, and not having any good reports. The civil suit that was filed initially found in Evans' favor, but that was overturned on appeal at the Supreme Court. At the end of the day, the amount that the RLDS Church won was relatively small. So in other words, they found that there were a bunch of errors and they won in a kind of a moral sense. But obviously it had a big cost in negative publicity again, the different newspapers ate this kind of thing up. Just on a side note, for myself as a historian and a historian of the congregation, the detailed testimony that members give, we have a book just thick with the testimony of like the woman who's in charge of the women's auxiliary and whether she has control of her own budget or not and all this kind of thing. It just gives us a really rare snapshot of the lived church experience in the 1910s. It was very sad for the people at the time to be going through this kind of civil war and everything like that. For us as historians, it's kind of nice that we have the evidence and the information now. So some of the members of the Christian Brotherhood, the Church of the Christian Brotherhood, apparently longed, to just like, let's move on from this fight. We don't need to go and recriminate with the RLDS Church. One of the things that the church actually brought in its charter was, it was kind of like R.C. Evans kind of had anti-authoritarian complaints against F.M. Smith. And so the charter really gave a lot of power to the business meeting to control purchasing and everything else. And one of the things the business meeting then, in one of the business meetings, they voted to prevent the bishop from speaking or publishing against the former church. However, obviously, that we don't know what happened between meetings, but that presumably made R.C. Evans pretty mad. And so after further argument and arm twisting, this resolution was overturned at the later vote the next week. And also finally, it called for the fight to be resumed and to pay for pamphlets and things to be published. So although, oopsie, I'm missing a slide. Oh, well, that's sad. Okay, so I'm missing one slide, but I'll just mention what happens in the intervening lost slide here. And so this fight probably, would have continued. But what ends up happening is that, so in fact, R.C. Evans in 1921, in January of 1921, he's prepared a whole series of anti-RLDS church lectures that he's intending to give. But he contracts pneumonia and at the age of 60, the very young age of 60, relatively in January of 1921, he dies. And so the fight in that sense kind of ends. The churches remain now separated, and the Church of the Christian Brotherhood now continues without essentially the guy for whom they kind of came into being. I mean, they are a whole group of a couple hundred people, and they have a property and a church and all this sort of thing. But the problem with it is that they don't have. They were kind of the power of R.C. Evans as a preacher was what was actually going to fill this church that they bought up. And so since that doesn't happen, instead what happens is it kind of limps along for a number of decades. And so although Evans' church outlived him, I'd say the members kind of lost their primary focal point. So eventually the group sold their Elm Street church to Sick Kids Hospital. A later church on Maitland Street is now the site of the Ontario Ballet offices. I walk past there a lot. It's very close to where I live. Their final facility in Willowdale was actually ultimately sold to the RLDS church in 1966 and became where the Willowdale congregation met until it was sold. Now Willowdale has cottage meetings. And the proceeds of that last sale were used by the church to create a foundation that is operating a charity called the Wexford, that to this day operates a seniors home in Scarborough. So there is still that charitable legacy that remains, even though the church itself doesn't continue. And I'll just mention from the Toronto side, the Toronto Congregation RLDS side, despite the catastrophe of losing so many members when R.C. Evans left, the branch rallied, regrouped, and again outgrew its facility that it had on Soho Street. The Soho Street Church was sold to an African-Canadian congregation, and the new facility was built on Bathurst Street, the first phase of which was dedicated in 1931, and the congregation kept meeting in that point into the lower auditorium, the gymnasium, until funds were raised in the 1960s to complete the top and ultimately to pay off the mortgage of the building. The congregation continued to have culturally this kind of independent streak that R.C. Evans, I think, maybe helped foster. And so the congregation was also the last congregation to surrender its deed, I think, to the World Church, out of the Canadian congregations anyway. It was then in 2015 that after a couple of years after the Bathurst Street building was sold, that the congregation moved to its current location in Center Place. But what I really like to say is we brought our history and our memory along with us. And so as a result of that, I've been able to prepare this fairly easily. We have all of this material, all those photos and everything like that are just in the archives, and all of those, you can see the shelves there where they're all being housed. And so that's my presentation on Bishop R.C. Evans of Canada.
Thank you, John. It's always a joy to hear your latest research. I mean, who knew R.C. Evans had such a fascinating life story? I also love that your congregation has its own archives. I wish every congregation had their own archives and worked so hard to preserve their story as your congregation does. So thank you for being that model congregation and inspiring us.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we so our specialty is trying to preserve as much as possible the history of the church in Canada specifically. And so we also are wanting to be a repository for Herald House books in general, but obviously the temple is doing that kind of a thing. So that's our special focus. And thank you again for inviting me to be part of this series. I just think it's such an important way to share these stories, broadly, and also specifically to be looking at the international stories. And so I'm so happy that you chose to do this, Barb. Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us. John is giving lectures practically every Tuesday night on the Toronto Center Place, and you can find him on Facebook and on YouTube. But every Tuesday evening, John, is it at 7 p.m. Eastern or 8 p.m. Eastern?
8 p.m. Eastern, just like your schedule. So just on Tuesday though, instead of Thursday.
And they're history lectures, sometimes they're art lectures. They're just wonderful. So if you enjoyed the lecture tonight, I would encourage you to mark your calendar for every Tuesday night attending a lecture with John. I also want to take a time to thank Megan Reed for helping as a co-host this evening and for managing everything from behind the scenes. And lastly, we share our thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for joining us tonight and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites with your donations. We have raised $1,700 tonight, all thanks to your generosity. And that $1,700 in donations will be doubled thanks to our generous board of directors. So thank you all for your support. I also want to encourage you to tune in this Saturday for our final lecture in the Autumn Lecture Series. In this Saturday's program, Andrew Bolton will explore the story behind the Community of Christ Church seal. The program will begin at 12 p.m. noon Central Time. Megan has already dropped a link to the Autumn Lecture Series in the chat box. Follow that link to register for this Saturday's program. I'm also excited to share that we will host an online history class in the new year. And this class will explore the life of Joseph Smith III. Lachlan Mackay and I will partner up on this 8-week class that'll explore the people and places that help create Joseph Smith III's story and his unique approach to leadership. The class will take place online every Thursday evening from February 4th through March 17th. Thursday nights are church history nights here for us at the Foundation. The class will also use the Roger Lanius biography of Joseph Smith III as a base. If you don't already own this biography, you can easily purchase it online at the Red Brick Store. And that website is www.redbrickstore.com. Additional details are headed your way soon, along with an opening date for registration for this online class. I just wanted you to all be among the first to know about it. We are planning all sorts of opportunities to enjoy church history in the new year, and I couldn't be more thrilled. We wouldn't be able to do these programs without your generosity, so thank you. Well, friends, until we gather again, please take care, keep reading your church history, and have a blessed night. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.